Thank you for joining us, Professor Bonsall. To start off, could you tell us a little bit about the kind of research that you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm based in biology here in Oxford, and the research we do in the group is really focused around the interface of mathematics and biology. So I'm an ecologist and environmental scientist by training. I was interested in population dynamics, so how things fluctuate through time and space, how numbers go up and down. And we're interested in thinking that's a sort of very dynamical issue and so how things change. So using maths to help us understand that has been our tools of the trade to sort of get us through our understanding. And in the group now I have lots of people doing lots of very, very different things, all the way down from sort of like developmental and cell biology through antimicrobial resistance, thinking about ecology and evolution, and more broader things beyond the boundaries of biology as well.
In another direction, I found a phrase on your website that I thought was quite interesting. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, what it means. It was the role of spatial structure on shared enemy and competing enemy interactions. What is that, and how do you study it?
Yeah, so my PhD was based on understanding insect population dynamics, where you have two prey species that share a common natural enemy. So maybe like a predator in that sense. And we know if there's nothing else happening, there's no other feedbacks, the only thing that's happening to these two prey species is that they're being eaten in some sense, and they're not limited by any resource in that sense. This natural enemy can actually have dynamic consequences. It can actually drive one of those species extinct, but simply because one species is unable to respond fast enough than the other. So that's sort of like the shared enemy problem in ecology. And it's a very common, again, conceptual problem. And what we were trying to do, what we've been, since I did this on my PhD, is really thinking about mechanisms that solve that sort of problem, right? So really thinking about what do we need, what sort of additional ecological, biological process have to be operating in order for species that share multiple natural enemies, sort of like are able to sort of like coexist in that sense, right? And it's a little bit esoteric and a little bit weird in that sense, but it's there are lots of ways that we can think about the way in which other things operate to sort of like stop this consequence of a predator eating two prey and one of them going extinct. And one of them is spatial structure. So the fact is now there's structure in space rather than time. So now we have a species now that's able to have little refuges where the predator can't get to it. That's space. Then it's found a bit of space where it can't be eaten, and then maybe the other ones too. So then it's stuff like it doesn't get complete. There's points in space where it's now not attacked. The predator can't get to, and that's sufficient to sort of like stop this predator driving one of those two species extinct. There are other ways you can sort of have temporal refuges where things actually, one species has one refuge during one point in time and then it moves on and there's another species has another refuge in a different point in time, and those can work in the same sort of way. And there's lots of ways in which those sorts of shared enemy interactions play out, and they're very common. The fact is that multiple species share the same predator means that these are very common ecological interactions that we see in food webs. So it's really been a sort of like challenge to try and understand why do we see, again, it goes back to that Elton and May problem about why do we see ecosystems as complex as we do, and how are they sort of like persisting? Yeah? I'll avoid the word using stable, but how are they persisting? And they're dynamic, right? And this is a dynamic that operates in both time and space, and that's one of the sort of like understanding how numbers of species, distributions of species are changing in time and space is what ecology is all about in that sense.
I see. Great, thank you. Is there any possibility at all to use a reductionist approach in ecology?
Yeah, so there is that. So we tend to think, we've taken that approach. So you sort of like look at, as I was just talking about, these feedbacks, right? Those feedbacks are operating at some sort of high level. There are interactions between species. Maybe it's let's take a simple example where it's just within a group, within a species, there's now competition within that species for resource, right? And then you think, well, actually, then you want to understand the mechanism. So that's really what we were, part of ecology is trying to understand some mechanisms. So how far can we go down? So you can say, well, actually, there's feedback. Well, that feedback is mediated by competition for resources. Maybe it's like, species competing for flowers or whatever it might be. And there's only a finite number of flowers, there are only a limited number of flowers, so those species are going to sort of like interact, and only some of them are going to get that resource. So that we can start to understand that mechanism, because that then has consequences. So we understand that mechanism, then we can maybe sort of like use that mechanistic basis to sort of like build back out to the feedback that we observe at this higher level. And then we can go down even further. So actually that competition that we see between the species competing for flowers is actually driven by sort of like a mechanism associated with behaviour. So then we sort of like looking at the whatever it is, let's call it bees, for example, right? So we're now looking at the bees and we're watching their behaviour, and actually some bees are able to sort of like identify flowers much faster than others. So now we've got a behavioural mechanism that sort of helps us understand that. And then we can go down even further, and actually it's sort of taking that reductionist approach, and now we can understand, well, what is the wiring within the bee brain that's actually making them realise that these flowers, they can identify these flowers faster than these flowers. So yeah, there is that. And then, but as I said, the problem becomes back then is how then do you put these things back together, right? And that's a problem in science. And obviously that's the approach that we've taken in doing our science, is to take this very reductionist approach. So we get down to, how do individual molecules interact in some sense to drive out cellular process that then drives out tissue formation, that draws out how your brain works and all of that sort of stuff. So it becomes a real challenge about building that. That's not to say it's not interesting or we shouldn't be doing it. And we have, thinking about how we run up this hierarchy of scaling and how we run back down this hierarchy of scaling as well is really, really interesting, all this sort of stuff, right? But yeah, we want to get at, for whatever reason, we're interested in mechanism. Yeah, whatever scientists are interested in mechanism, right? So unpacking all of that is obviously something we want to do.
I see. You mentioned a hierarchy of scaling. Something that has interested me in the past is thinking about species like ants and the fact that they live in colonies, and sometimes you hear that it's better to treat the entire colony as an individual rather than the ant itself.
Yeah.
When can we do that? For which species can we do that? Like, can we
Right.
do the same thing for humans and say that a group of humans should be considered an individual? Like,
Yeah.
when is it a useful thing to do?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, right? And it gets into the sort of like heart of what we think about in terms of biology, and particularly, our organising law in biology is evolution. And we really think about, well, when you're thinking about evolution, then you're thinking about, well, where is the strength of selection strongest, right? So that could be at the individual gene level, it could be at the genome level, it could be at the individual level, it could be at the group level, it could be at the species level. All of that is perfectly admissible within the theory of evolution, right? So then you think, well, what is evolution actually doing? Well, evolution is actually altering survival and reproduction on any one of those sorts of scales, right? The fact that a gene survives and then gets passed on to the next generation, or a species survives and gets passed on in that sense, are all sort of the same mechanism of evolution in that sense. So what you then have to do to unpack your question about whether it's ants or humans or individuals is really thinking, where is the strongest bit of selection operating on survival and reproduction? So in ants, and in ants in particular, what they've done through evolution, many of them have foregone reproduction and they look after a queen, or bees or wasps are looking after a queen, and that is the focus then is supporting that individual, so the reproduction and survival of that individual, so that they pass the colony's genes and all of that activity on to future generations. So there's obviously lots of thinking about that and around. So that involves cooperation. It involves sort of like within these ants, they have to cooperate. They have to forego reproduction. And in ants, it's been that over time that has been, and there's pretty well worked. And not necessarily in ants, but in wasps, how those sorts of social structures have actually evolved out from groups of wasps that would not, groups of what it's more evident in wasps. We can see different groups of wasps doing this. So there are groups of wasps that live solitary. There are groups of wasps that live in colonies where they still all reproduce, and then slowly you can see different groups of wasps where actually some of them have reproductive hierarchies. So some reproduce, some don't, and then you get out to the full sort of like the things that we see flying around at this time of year, where they're all the worker wasps sort of like eating our ice creams or whatever it might be, because they're hell bent on trying to get sugar back to the feed those larvae and feed that colony and keep that colony going, all in the sense of just favouring the reproduction and survival of that queen individual. So can you apply that to humans? Well, it's actually the organisation, the fact that these wasps and ants and bee colonies are organised in such a way. So there's a group of workers who go out and forage. There's a group of police who sort of like police everything. There's a group of individuals that tend the nest. There's a group of sort of like bodyguards around the queen. So yeah, you can think, well, actually maybe that organisation has some sort of like analogies to human society, and they do in that sense. But we're thinking in that sense, you can take that analogy and apply it to human societies. But taking the idea about evolution and why they've evolved into this super organisms they're sometimes called, and it may be a stretch too far for human societies, because we're all still, in that sense, selection, if it is operating in humans, is operating on individuals, as it does in many species across the planet. They don't have that cooperative breeding. It's the survival and reproduction of individuals, and that's a very stochastic thing in that sense, right? Some individuals are capable of breeding, some individuals will forego that for whatever reason, right? So then we can get into the sort of like very nebulous spaces about using those theories in evolutionary biology and applying them to human evolution. We have to be very careful with all of that, right?
The question that's begging to be asked is, can we use these insights in deciding human policy to protect certain groups from predation by others?
Yeah.
Is that a valid question to ask?
No, that's a valid question to ask, and again, we have to be careful with taking those answers, but the approaches for sure we can sort of like think about, right? And again, our mathematics can help us in all of this as well. So let's just take a hypothetical scenario. Now you have two groups, right? And there's climate change, and there's knowledge being created by those groups, right? And one group has capacity to produce more knowledge than another group, but this other group is more at risk from climate change, right? That's an inequity that we see throughout the world in this sense, right? With sort of like social justice and environmental justice, right? So we can start to use our mathematics to actually understand, well, both groups create knowledge. One creates knowledge at a faster rate, and then actually that knowledge can be used to sort of like affect how we deal with the technology. Say that knowledge is able to develop technologies that help us deal with climate change. Well, then how do we distribute that knowledge in such a way that both groups have access to it, that actually then mitigates out the effects of climate change, right? That's a perfectly valid question. It uses all the mathematics and all the sort of some of the ideas that we would use in ecology. You're creating knowledge, you're using resource in some way. You're having some shared public good. The climate is a shared public good. The knowledge is a shared public good in that sense. And how do those two things interact to actually mitigate that at-risk group? What is the optimal way that knowledge should be shared, or making it more equitable, that actually this group doesn't suffer the consequences of social and climate injustice in that sense, right? So yeah, there are certainly ways that we can start to think about the way in which we have developed these ideas in sort of like the fundamentals of ecology, let's call it, and our mathematics that that are well worked and well developed across disciplines, and use them in a way that sort of helps us understand how the world works and how we can solve these sorts of contemporary problems.
All right. My last question for today, and please take as much time as you want to answer this one. Is there anything from your experience in studying ecology that has changed how you look at humans and how humans interact and human societies, human lives?
Yeah. So as I said, I grew up doing environmental science research and using mathematics and experiments and observations and all of that. So it gives you a set of tools, gives you a set of math tools, which are pretty interesting in that sense and useful in thinking about how ecological systems work. But those math tools are math tools, and they can be used in lots of interesting ways. And just talked about one hypothetical example where we could sort of like develop that out with the sort of like social injustice stuff. But another one that's more sort of like where we have developed that out, where we've got a better understanding of human activity, is using the maths that we've developed, that we've regularly used in ecology for understanding mental health issues. So in that we can think about the mental health issues around bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress syndrome, and really thinking about what are it's an ecological problem, because psychology is, at least in my mind, is a little bit like ecology. It's an aggregate of all of those neuroprocesses to give rise to sort of like cognitive function in some sense. So it's like scaling up again, right? So just like ecology is scaling up across hierarchies of biology, psychology is scaling up across hierarchies of sort of like neural activity within our heads. So in that sense, you can sort of like take some of the maths that we've developed in ecology and actually apply it out to understanding mental health issues. And that's sort of like been pretty interesting. It's sort of like given us insights into the way in which these sorts of conditions emerge, how our maths helps us in thinking about treating these sorts of mental health disorders, or even sort of like getting in before they become fully aberrant in that sense and fully dysfunctional. Let me give you one example about where that is used a lot. So we work a lot on intrusive memories, which are a precursor to post-traumatic stress syndrome. So intrusive memories are flashbacks of traumatic events that people experience after they've had trauma. And what we can do is that we can intervene to sort of like reduce the intensity and the vividness and of those sorts of memories. And it sort of like required us to think about, well, what is the process by which those memories are re-entering our heads? And it turns out that with a bit of maths and an understanding this cognitive processes, we have to have a two-phase approach to treating them. So it's ideal. So this memory is intruding. It's getting into our thoughts. It's getting into the activity of our daily lives because we experience some sort of trauma. So the way you have to treat it is actually compete that memory against the neutral memory. So a neutral memory is just something that's benign. It's something to do. And the way that's been developed out to treat that intrusive memory is actually visual, and it's actually playing games, computer games that developed in the 1980s. So Tetris turns out to be a fantastic way of like reducing traumatic memories. But you can't just play Tetris, right? You get an intrusive memory, you think, I've got to play Tetris. It doesn't quite work like that, right? So our maths has helped us, and our sort of like our sort of observations and doing sort of like lab trials with people and doing lab trials with participants, and then treating people who have been in road traffic accidents or women who've had difficult childbirth with the same sort of approach has allowed us to get a richer understanding of how this works. What do you have to do? You've got this intrusive memory. You actually have to reactivate that intrusive memory. You've got to bring it back to mind. What does that mean? Well, you actually have to show the participant or the patient a still or a snapshot of that traumatic event. That memory is now held in your head, and it's what we call, it's been labile. It's just fluid in that sense, right? And memories are super fluid things, and it's really interesting that they are super fluid things. But when they're in this fluid state, you can then play Tetris. You have to reactivate them. You can then play Tetris, high-speed Tetris, doing mental rotation of changing those blocks around, trying to compete against the computer so it doesn't all crash out, and just filling that out. Right? Maybe 20 minutes is sufficient to actually reduce the rate and number of these intrusive memories. And we can record that with patients after when they've done and haven't done this sort of reactivation, play Tetris. So yeah, and that's all sort of built around some of the maths that we've used in the other disciplines to sort of like think through this. And it turns out to give us a really rich understanding of this, of how that cognitive process is working. And that's a cognitive process, but we want to try and scale back down, because that cognitive process is underpinned by neurons firing at different rates, right? So the scaling, exactly like we were talking about a while ago about the mechanisms that are operating on all of this, right? We want to get at that mechanistic understanding by thinking about how does the neuroprocesses give rise to this cognitive process. So that's all pretty cool and all pretty interesting, and actually really, really important. And we're just finishing up a study at the minute with healthcare professionals in the NHS who've suffered trauma on a daily basis, and being able to think about how these sorts of interventions of playing Tetris actually work for them. And they're simple things, and they are, in some sense, something that once you understand how to do it, you can just use on a almost on a daily basis in that sense, right? So really understanding how efficacious those sorts of approaches are is all pretty cool, and we call it mood maths. Right, because it's all based on mood in some sense, right? So we're able to use our maths, to think about mood and intrusive memories and think about it. So it's all very cool.
That's incredible. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for your time.